Picture this. May 1945. The war in Europe finally ends, and overnight one of the most powerful air forces the world has ever seen simply vanishes into silence. Across the shattered landscape of a defeated Germany, from the frozen airfields of Norway down to the mountains of Austria, thousands upon thousands of aircraft sit abandoned under gray skies, their engines cold, their propellers still. These aren't just ordinary planes. Among the rows of grounded fighters and bombers are machines that represent technology years, sometimes decades, ahead of anything the Allies have seen before, cutting-edge jets that can outrun anything in the sky, experimental prototypes that look like they belong in science fiction, and engineering secrets that could reshape the future of aviation itself. The moment Germany surrenders, a silent race begins, not fought with guns or bombs anymore, but with intelligence teams, transport planes, and the desperate need to capture, study, or destroy every last piece of this technological treasure trove before it falls into the wrong hands. When the capitulation takes effect on the 8th of May 1945, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force that once ruled the skies over Europe with absolute dominance, simply ceases to exist as a fighting force. It doesn't go down in some final heroic battle or dramatic last stand. It just stops. The fuel runs out, the command structure collapses, and across hundreds of airfields scattered throughout what remains of the Third Reich, aircraft are left exactly where they sit, silent witnesses to the end of an era. Some of these planes are perfectly intact, ready to fly if only someone would fuel them up and turn the key. Others have been stripped down for parts by desperate mechanics trying to keep a handful of machines in the air during those chaotic final weeks. Still others bear the scars of Allied bombing raids, their wings torn, their fuselages riddled with holes. But even these damaged birds hold secrets worth studying. In the north, around Flensburg and Lübeck, vast collections of grounded aircraft wait in organized rows, a haunting display of military power rendered completely useless. Travel south to Prague and you'll find hangars absolutely packed with Messerschmitts, Heinkels, and bizarre late-war prototypes that never made it past the experimental stage. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility, Allied investigators walk through what feels like a museum of the future, discovering experimental airframes that push the boundaries of what flight can be, wind tunnel models showing aerodynamic research that's years ahead of Allied efforts, and mountains of technical documents that reveal just how far German jet and rocket research has actually progressed. The variety of surviving aircraft genuinely shocks many Allied officers who thought they knew what they were up against. Sure, there are the classics everyone recognizes, the legendary Messerschmitt Bf 109 that's been Germany's frontline fighter since before the war even started, and the brutally effective Focke-Wulf FW 190 that gave Allied pilots nightmares over France and Russia. But then there are the game changers, the aircraft that represent an entirely different level of aviation technology. The Arado AR-234, the world's first operational jet bomber, sleek and fast enough that Allied fighters simply cannot catch it. The Heinkel He-162, a lightweight jet fighter that was rushed into production so quickly they called it the Volksjäger, the people's fighter, built with wood and metal in factories hidden underground. And then there are the truly experimental machines like the remains of the Junkers Ju-287 bomber with its forward-swept wings, a design so radical that Allied engineers have trouble believing it could actually fly. Scattered across every airfield are the workhorses too, the transport planes and reconnaissance aircraft that kept the Luftwaffe functioning, the reliable Junkers Ju-52 trimotor transports, and the Heinkel He-111 bombers that had been adapted for every role imaginable. Many of these aircraft haven't flown in weeks because there simply isn't any fuel left. In those final chaotic days of the war, as the Reich crumbles and supply lines completely break down, entire units find themselves with perfectly good aircraft that are nothing more than expensive metal sculptures because there's no gasoline to put in their tanks. By the time the shooting stops, the Luftwaffe's entire administrative structure has disintegrated. Commanders surrender to whatever Allied forces happen to be nearest, sometimes American, sometimes British, sometimes Soviet, and ground crews often just walk away from their posts without waiting for orders that will never come. Aircraft maintenance records that would tell you the history and condition of each plane are incomplete, scattered, or deliberately destroyed. Fuel depots are empty or bombed into craters. Spare parts warehouses are looted or burned. The Allied Control Commission, the multinational body now responsible for occupied Germany, moves quickly to establish ironclad rules. Every single German aircraft is grounded, period. No exceptions. No German pilot is allowed to so much as start an engine without direct written authorization from Allied authorities. These aren't just bureaucratic rules, they're security measures designed to prevent unauthorized flights, to stop high-ranking Nazis from escaping to South America or Spain, and to ensure that no one can move senior officials or looted gold or anything else away from Allied control. But very quickly, a debate erupts within Allied military commands about what should happen to all these aircraft. Some officers take a hard line, arguing that every German plane represents a potential threat if left intact, that they should be destroyed immediately before someone figures out how to use them again. Others, particularly intelligence officers and engineers, see something completely different when they look at these machines. They see years of research and development that would cost millions of dollars and countless hours to replicate. They see answers to technical questions the Allies have been struggling with. They see jet engines, swept-wing designs, and advanced materials that could give their own countries a massive advantage in whatever comes after this war. What becomes crystal clear from the very first days after the surrender is that the fate of the Luftwaffe's aircraft isn't just a military question anymore. It's an intelligence operation, a logistics challenge, and most importantly, a political calculation that will help determine which nation emerges from World War II as the dominant air power. The Americans move first, and they move fast. On May 9th, literally the day after the formal German surrender, American intelligence teams launched something called Operation Lusty, and yes, that's actually the official name, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. Led by Colonel Harold Watson, a highly experienced test pilot who understands exactly what he's looking for. These teams spread out across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia like a highly organized treasure hunt. Their mission brief is straightforward. Locate the most advanced aircraft Germany has built, secure all technical documents and blueprints, and transport selected machines back to the United States for extensive testing and evaluation. At Lechfeld Airfield in southern Germany, American forces hit the jackpot when they secure several intact Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, the world's first operational jet fighters, machines that are significantly faster than anything the Americans or British can put in the air. At Grove Airfield in Denmark, they discover Arado jet bombers and a fascinating mix of late-war prototypes that show just how desperate and innovative German designers had become in those final months. The aircraft deemed most valuable are either carefully flown back to Allied airfields by American test pilots who've been hastily trained on German systems, or they're meticulously dismantled, packed into crates, and shipped across the Atlantic to Wright Field Testing Center in Ohio, where America's top aviation engineers are waiting to tear them apart and understand every last detail. Other captured aircraft go to Freeman Field in Indiana, where specialized evaluation units catalog every piece of equipment, study every engine component, and document every innovative design feature they can find. The pilots of what became known as Watson's Whizzers, an elite flight group composed of experienced American test pilots, actually fly these captured German jets under carefully controlled conditions, pushing them to their limits, documenting their performance, and writing detailed reports that will shape American understanding of swept wings, jet propulsion, and high-speed aerodynamics for years to come. Meanwhile, the British are running their own parallel operation called Operation Surgeon, but with a slightly different focus that reveals their particular priorities. While the Americans are primarily interested in capturing physical aircraft, the British understand that the real treasure isn't just the machines themselves but the brilliant minds that designed and built them. Teams from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Britain's premier aviation research facility, move into captured airfields at Fassberg, Schleswig, Husum, and Rechlin, And they don't just collect aircraft, they collect people. They interview surviving German engineers, scientists, and technicians, asking detailed technical questions, gathering documents, and identifying the individuals whose expertise could be most valuable. Selected experts, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes under more coercive circumstances, are transferred to British facilities where they'll continue their work, but now for the Crown instead of the Reich. At RAF Farnborough, British test pilots take their turn flying captured German aircraft, including the feared Me-262, carefully evaluating its strengths and weaknesses, figuring out its vulnerabilities, and learning lessons that will influence British jet development for the next decade. The British show particular interest in the Heinkel He-162, that lightweight jet fighter that was rushed into production near the war's end, because its design offers valuable lessons for future trainers and interceptors that need to be both fast and economical to build. But the Americans and British aren't the only ones playing this game. The Soviet Union, which paid an unimaginable price in blood to defeat Germany on the Eastern Front, has absolutely no intention of letting the Western Allies monopolize German aviation technology. Soviet trophy brigades, specialized military units trained for exactly this kind of large-scale industrial seizure, sweep across Saxony, Thuringia, Silesia, and Czechoslovakia, methodically seizing factories and airfields in territory under Red Army control. Major production centers like the Avia Works in Prague, which had been churning out aircraft for the Luftwaffe, fall under Soviet control along with all their tooling, machinery, and technical documentation. Assembly lines that had been producing the Bf-109 in Moravia are dismantled piece by piece and shipped eastward by rail, often along with the German engineers who know how to operate them, whether they want to go or not. At military air bases near Moscow and Leningrad, Soviet pilots and aircraft designers examine captured Me-262s and AR-234s with intense interest, taking detailed measurements, studying every system, and integrating their findings into the early jet projects that will eventually produce aircraft like the MiG-15. Competition among the Allies quickly intensifies, sometimes reaching levels of tension that hint at the Cold War that's about to begin. Each power wants access to the rarest and most advanced aircraft, especially those experimental prototypes that exist in only one or two examples. There are angry disagreements and diplomatic incidents over which side has the right to certain machines, particularly at sites in central Germany where American and Soviet forces arrived within days of each other and both claim authority. The Allied Control Council tries to coordinate these collection efforts and establish some kind of fair distribution system, but tensions reflecting the emerging divide between East and West are already clearly visible in how jealously each side guards its captured technology. Throughout all of this, German personnel find themselves in a strange and uncomfortable position. Former Luftwaffe pilots, experienced mechanics, and skilled engineers are suddenly valuable assets rather than defeated enemies. They answer technical questions for their captors, sometimes under direct supervision and sometimes as part of temporary employment agreements that offer them food, security, and hope for the future. Their explanations and demonstrations prove absolutely crucial in helping Allied teams operate complex systems like the Jumo 004 jet engine with its temperamental turbine blades, the BMW 003 that requires precise starting procedures, and advanced navigation equipment that uses technology the Allies haven't seen before. Everything gets documented in obsessive detail, thousands of photographs capturing every angle of every aircraft, complete sets of blueprints copied and distributed, flight manuals translated into English and Russian, and test reports analyzed by teams of experts, all before the final decision gets made about which aircraft will be preserved for long-term study and which will be destroyed. By late 1946, the major collection efforts are essentially complete. Dozens of the most important Luftwaffe aircraft have been carefully transported to facilities in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union where they'll be studied, tested, and reverse-engineered for years. These programs will have an enormous influence on early jet development in all three countries, informing the design of the next generation of military aircraft and setting the technological stage for the Cold War arms race that's about to begin. But while the most valuable examples have been saved for research, the vast majority of Luftwaffe aircraft face a very different fate, one that will transform airfields across Europe into sprawling industrial graveyards. By late 1945, the Allied Control Council issues a clear and uncompromising directive: Germany cannot, under any circumstances, be allowed to retain any military aircraft whatsoever. The most valuable and technologically advanced examples have already been shipped away to America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Now comes the massive task of dealing with everything that remains, and we're talking about thousands upon thousands of aircraft, a staggering amount of hardware that needs to be eliminated. Between 1945 and 1948, airfields across Europe are transformed into vast disposal and scrapping operations. The directive from Allied authorities is brutally simple. Every German aircraft, whether it's a frontline fighter, a heavy bomber, a transport plane, a training aircraft, or an experimental prototype, has to be completely eliminated unless it's been specifically reserved for research purposes. Military bases such as Flensburg, Lübeck-Blankensee, Grove in Denmark, and Tarnwitz on the Baltic coast become massive disposal hubs where Allied crews work day after day to systematically strip and crush airframes, feeding aluminum and steel back into Europe's desperately resource-starved rebuilding industries. At Grove, rows upon rows of fighters that survived the entire war are methodically dismantled, their engines removed, their instruments stripped out, their airframes cut up with industrial saws and crushed. In northern Germany, British demolition teams destroy intact bombers that made it through Allied bombing campaigns only to end up in pieces on the ground after the surrender. Even late-war jets, those revolutionary aircraft that represent the cutting edge of aviation technology, are broken down for scrap metal unless they've already been specifically assigned to ongoing test programs in the United States or Britain. Some aircraft meet even more dramatic ends, burned in massive funeral pyres that fill the air with black smoke for days, or loaded onto barges, towed out into the Baltic or North Sea, and deliberately sunk in deep water. Many of these underwater wrecks still lie exactly where they fell, occasionally rediscovered decades later by divers exploring the seabed, finding remarkably preserved aircraft in the cold, dark water. The restrictions extend beyond just military aviation. Even civilian aircraft that could theoretically be used for commercial purposes face intense scrutiny. The Junkers Ju-52, that reliable trimotor transport that had served both military and civilian roles before and during the war, presents a particular challenge. Each example is reviewed on a case-by-case basis by Allied committees trying to determine whether it could have legitimate civilian use or whether it represents potential military capability that needs to be eliminated. Some are eventually converted for limited transport services in carefully controlled circumstances, but the majority still end up in the scrapyards because Allied policy demands consistency and thoroughness. In Czechoslovakia, where factories had churned out German-designed aircraft throughout the war, captured planes briefly transition into service under new Czech Air Force designations before political pressure and practical concerns lead to the majority being retired and dismantled within a few years. France, which operates several German aircraft types for training and limited testing purposes right after the war, eventually phases them all out as spare parts become impossible to find and maintenance challenges multiply with each passing month. To this day, historians still debate whether more aircraft should have been preserved for historical purposes. Several researchers make compelling arguments that many historically unique airframes, one-of-a-kind prototypes and rare variants that would be priceless today, were lost during this period simply because no museums or archives had the space, funding, or frankly the interest to store them. In 1946 and 1947, with Europe in ruins and millions of people displaced or starving, the idea of preserving old military aircraft seemed like an absurd luxury. Other historians counter that Allied priorities were absolutely correct given the circumstances, that the political desire to completely dismantle Germany's war-making capability outweighed any concerns about preserving artifacts for future generations, and that in the context of the time, these were reasonable decisions. The limited number of surviving authentic Luftwaffe aircraft that exist in museums today, perhaps a few dozen examples worldwide, is a direct result of this systematic disposal phase. Economic factors played a huge role in driving the destruction process forward. Europe in 1945 and 1946 faces catastrophic shortages of basic materials. The aluminum and steel that make up aircraft airframes represent valuable resources that are desperately needed for reconstruction. Recycling these materials helps supply industries that are trying to produce consumer goods, infrastructure materials, and essential machinery for economic recovery. For many local workers in occupied Germany, employment in aircraft scrapping operations provides stable income during an otherwise chaotic and uncertain transition period. By 1948, the vast majority of Luftwaffe aircraft simply no longer exist. The runways that once hosted elite fighter units and powerful bomber groups are cleared of debris and repurposed. Some become training grounds for Allied occupation forces who will remain in Germany for decades. Others revert to farmland, reclaimed by nature almost as quickly as they were built. Still others are transformed into civilian airports that will eventually connect a rebuilt Germany to the rest of the world. But even as most Luftwaffe aircraft are being systematically destroyed across Europe, a smaller number of these German-designed machines enter a surprising second life under foreign flags, serving countries that need aircraft desperately and can't afford to be too picky about where they come from. From 1946 onward, several nations operate German-designed aircraft out of necessity, practical availability, or genuine technical interest in what these machines can do. These foreign-operated fleets are often quite short-lived, plagued by parts shortages and maintenance difficulties, but they play an unexpectedly important role in early post-war aviation history, and in some cases, they make the difference between having an air force and having nothing at all. Czechoslovakia becomes one of the very first nations to systematically repurpose German aviation equipment on a large scale. The factories in Prague, Kunovice, and Letniny hold both completed aircraft and partially finished airframes sitting in various stages of assembly when the war ends. Czech engineers, many of whom had been forced to build aircraft for the Germans during occupation, now use that same expertise to assemble these machines into operational fighters for their own newly independent air force. The most famous result of this effort is the Avia S-199, essentially a Czechoslovak-built version of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, but with significant modifications due to parts availability issues. The S-199 earns a reputation as an incredibly difficult aircraft to fly, with handling characteristics that even experienced pilots find challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it serves as the frontline fighter of the Czechoslovak Air Force until newer Soviet-built aircraft finally replace it in the early 1950s. Several S-199s are later sold to Israel in 1948, and here's where the story gets really interesting. These German-designed fighters, built in Czechoslovakia and flown by Israeli pilots, become the new nation's first fighter aircraft during its War of Independence, engaging Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian aircraft in the desperate battles that determine whether Israel will survive its first year of existence. Spain also extends the operational legacy of German fighters far beyond what anyone expected. Under license agreements dating back to the late 1930s, when Nazi Germany and Franco Spain were closely aligned, Spanish factories begin producing their own version of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 design with Spanish-made engines since they can't get German ones anymore. Called the Hispano-Aviation HA-1112, these Spanish Messerschmitts serve in the Spanish Air Force well into the mid-1950s, making them among the last piston-engine fighters in operational military service anywhere in Europe. Their most famous appearance comes decades after the war when these Spanish-built Bf 109s are used to portray German fighters in the classic 1969 film The Battle of Britain, because they're the only flyable examples that still exist and look authentic enough for cinema. Even Norway, despite being invaded and occupied by Germany during the war, operates captured Bf 109s and Arado AR-96 trainers during its early post-war rebuilding period. Parts shortages eventually ground these planes as finding replacement components becomes impossible, but several airframes survive in storage long enough for restoration efforts that begin in the 1960s and 1970s when aviation museums start actively seeking authentic World War II aircraft. Civil aviation also benefits indirectly from surviving German technology. The Junkers Ju-52, that sturdy trimotor transport, transitions into passenger service in several countries where its rugged reliability and ability to operate from rough airfields make it genuinely useful. In France, a variant called the AAC.1 Toucan is produced at nationalized Amiot factories and used extensively in colonial transport roles, flying cargo and passengers across North Africa and Indochina. Even reformed Lufthansa, the German national airline, briefly operates a handful of Ju-52s in the early 1950s as it struggles to rebuild commercial aviation in a divided Germany, before finally transitioning to modern purpose-built airliners. By the time West Germany establishes the Bundesluftwaffe, its new post-war air force, in 1956, absolutely none of the old Luftwaffe aircraft are even considered for operational use. The break with the past is complete and deliberate. The new West German Air Force relies entirely on Allied-built designs supplied through NATO aircraft like the American F-84 Thunderstreak, the Canadair Sabre built in Canada, and later the controversial F-104 Starfighter. German aviation culture has moved decisively into the jet age, leaving wartime piston engine designs firmly in the past where they belong. Meanwhile, efforts to preserve surviving airframes for historical and educational purposes gradually grow throughout the second half of the 20th century as the passage of time transforms these aircraft from recent weapons of war into valuable historical artifacts. Many of the examples you can see in museums today come from the most unlikely places: crash sites in remote forests, aircraft that went down in deep lakes and were preserved by cold water, or long-buried wrecks recovered from former battlefields on the Eastern Front. Professional restorers often face the challenging task of combining parts from multiple wrecked aircraft to create a single display-worthy example, essentially building one complete plane from the remains of several. In the modern era, only a very small number of intact original Luftwaffe aircraft still exist anywhere in the world. Precious examples of the revolutionary Me-262, the classic Bf-109, the brutal FW-190, and the sleek Arado AR-234 sit in climate-controlled museums from the Smithsonian in Washington to the Deutsches Museum in Berlin, carefully preserved for future generations to study and understand. A few privately built replicas, constructed using modern materials and techniques, occasionally fly at air shows, giving crowds a glimpse of what these legendary machines looked like in flight, but almost all original wartime airframes remain permanently grounded due to their irreplaceable historical value and the simple fact that flying them risks destroying artifacts that can never be replaced. What survives today represents only the tiniest fragment of the vast aerial armada that was once spread across every corner of Europe, thousands of aircraft that dominated the skies, terrorized cities, and represented the cutting edge of military technology. These few surviving examples serve as silent reminders of how quickly even the most advanced and powerful machines can disappear when history moves on, and how the decisions made in the chaotic aftermath of war can reshape the entire legacy of technology, nations, and the people who built them.